Hi, everyone. I wanted you to meet some of my friends today. One of them you've actually already met. But that's all right, because it just proves to you quite how awesome she is. Tongi, I'm sorry you're not on the slides, because much as I love you, you're not as beautiful as some of these people. Chorfan and Cheryl used to work in the ministry I'm currently in their futures group, thinking about what possibilities lay out there for Singapore. Jiachuan and Jeremy are two very, very good friends, both of whom are interested in building social enterprises for Singapore that are corporately well-organized and successful. So they're bridging the worlds of the social and the private sector. James is doing some wonderful work as, I'm not sure what to call him. He's one of those polymaths who cannot be defined. He's an innovator, an entrepreneur, technologist, and all of that rolled into one as he tries to build communities of young technology business people of the future. Bernice, I like to think of as redesigning design, as she works on helping groups in the social and public sectors apply design thinking to recraft the experiences that are out there for the people they work with. And what I'm continually struck by all of these people who are, in a sense, members of the smart nation of the future, is that they're all telling new stories. When the smart nation speaks, I'd like to think that it is able to tell new stories for what that future might look like. But before we talk about new stories, we need to understand what the old stories are. Anyone who's looked at a map will know that Singapore is small. Anyone who's been to one of the social studies classes that our students have had to do in the last 15 years or so will know that we're not just small, we have no natural resources, and our only natural resource is our people. And as our Indonesian neighbors periodically like to remind us, both literally and not so literally, we are a little red dot, a speck on the geographical expanse of the world that doesn't always matter. But I don't think those are the only stories that we can tell for ourselves. And I think it's really important that we have new stories to tell to become not just a smart nation, but a smart people. And one of those stories is this one. We can choose to have a fixed mindset, right? A mindset that says, what I am today, I will continue to be tomorrow. I am limited by what I was born with. Or we can choose to have a growth mindset. The mindset that Tongi exemplifies but didn't really talk about in his story earlier, which says something to his sister, but then proceeds to grow and learn and reflect and refine everything that he does, such that what he is today is only a fraction of what he can become tomorrow. And I think this growth mindset is going to be a key part of the stories that we need to tell ourselves in the future. Don't just take my word for it. Carol Dweck is doing some wonderful work on the importance of growth mindsets in terms of how it defines success for the future. And it's very telling in psychological research how much a growth mindset helps us to realize that we can become better tomorrow. It'll take a while, it'll take learning, it'll take hard work, but we can always keep improving. So that's one story. There's another story about what we are as groups of people. Are we just a crowd, unconnected by any kind of link or network or relationship? Or are we a community that has relationships and connections and links? I'd like to think that we are a community, or at least that we have the potential to become a really powerful community. A few years ago, many of us took part in what we called the Singapore Conversation, a process of defining on our own as citizens, not in a way that was told to us by top-down implementation, what we wanted to become. And I think it's really important to remember that communities are what we are, because when we come together, we know and do things that we cannot do by ourselves. That conversation process, thankfully, has not really ended. It's continued, both in the public policy realm and in the realms of the social and the private sectors. And again, this isn't something that we have invented. This isn't something that we do independently. Elinor Ostrom, who you see on this slide, your right, won a Nobel Prize for thinking about the role that communities can have in shaping the future. Not markets, not top-down government implementation, or what she called central direction, but communities, groups of people coming together to manage the resources that they have and achieving far more, far better than any market or state apparatus could do. The third story that I think all those friends are telling themselves is that systems are not rigid. They are subject continually to our influence. And I think this is really important because this is, in a sense, another way of putting what Tongyi was talking about in terms of a culture of permission. We can choose at any point to say, the system is there, it's cold, it's impersonal, it is shaping my life. Or we can choose to say that the system may be large and powerful, but we can influence it quietly, slowly, imperceptibly, every day. It boils down, I think, to where we feel our locus of control lies. Is the locus of control external to us? Are we really just a little red dot that is affected and buffeted by the winds of the world? Or are we beings with an internal locus? A locus that says, yes, there is a system out there, but I affect, through my choices and decisions, what kind of destiny I will have. And I think it's very important that one of our stories, at least, is to have an internal locus of control. To continually tell ourselves that however difficult an external environment is, we have a choice and we have an ability to shape the future that we move into. Which leads very nicely to the next story that I think people like Cheryl and Cho Fan and James and Jia Chuan and Tongyi, whose photo will go into the next version of this slide, also have, right? Which is that we're not just unconnected people. We're not defined by the gaps and the deficits and the things we cannot do, or the number of times we repeat particular exams, the number of things that we don't have or the weaknesses that we possess. We can be defined by the gifts and the assets that we have. And I think to be a truly smart nation, we need to see everything we have as assets. The abilities of the people, the institutions that they come from, the associations and the groups that they live and belong to, the physical assets that they have, and the connections that they have, the relationships and networks that they build. Yet again, none of this is particularly earth-shattering or new. Peter Block and John McKnight, who you see on this slide, have been working on the roles of gifts and assets and how they shape citizen life for decades in the US. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from the fact that they take gifts of the kind that the author Lewis Hyde talks about in his great book titled The Gift. These gifts and assets are not things that have immediate economic value. They are not things that have tangible monetary worth. But they have a value that cannot be exchanged. They have values that are intangible and intrinsic, but still fundamentally quite important. Because those are the things that make life meaningful and give meaning to the existence that we have. That's why when people talk about building a community or building a nation, I think it needs to be one that is done through an approach that's asset-based, that's focused on building a community, focused on its gifts and assets, not just the deficits, the gaps and the weaknesses of the things it doesn't have. Which leads me to story number 5, which is that it's very easy sometimes to look around us and think, wow, there's a lot that hasn't happened to me. I look at my life, and I was born in 1979. I went to primary 1 in 1986, secondary school in 1992, came back from university in 2002, and am now standing in 2015. Now, I could see those things as discrete events, not connected to each other at all. Or I can think of my life as a campaign, as a movement. And a campaign and a movement is wonderful because what it means is that everything can affect the future. Everything that we are and have come from has some kind of role in defining who we become. And we may not see that now. We may feel that everything that's happening to us today is difficult and horrible and insurmountable. But if we think of our life as a campaign and not just a series of events, then those insurmountable things can actually become part of a larger path. A path that tells us that even if today we are daunted by the enormity of what Rabbi Tarfon in the Jewish Ethics of the Fathers calls the enormity of the world's grief, there are still things we can do today. We can do justly now. We can love mercy and walk humbly now. And why is that important in trying to become a smart nation? I think it's important because this allows us not to self-flagellate, not to sit at the end of every day and think, oh my God, there's all the things I didn't do. I have failed. A life as a campaign allows us to go to sleep and wake up tomorrow and remember that it may not be for us to complete the task. Maybe someone else will come and finish it for us. But neither are we at liberty to desist from it. If we're going to build a smart nation is in essence a destination that we might never reach, right? But the journey matters. And even if we don't complete the task, what I'd like to think is that through government work, through volunteering, through teaching, through mentoring, through coaching, I make tomorrow's smart nation just that little bit better than today's smart nation might be. Because I'm not at liberty to desist from that very important task. My final story, the story that I think people like Cheryl and Cho Fan and Tong Yi are telling themselves, is that what we cannot solve, right, those complex problems out there, we can at least navigate and celebrate. And I'll tell you what I mean by this. It's the easiest thing in the world to believe that the burdens of a smart nation are pulling us apart. That we have to be technologically savvy and clever and have a large infrastructure and an effective implementation system all at the same time. We can choose to be like the person on the left of this diagram with the blue arrows coming out of him, right? Torn apart by the many forces that we have to deal with. Or we can choose to be like the person with the green arrows, pulled in different directions, stretched in different directions, but in a way that celebrates those tensions and the different things that we have to do. I think Walt Whitman put it best in his Song of Myself. He asks at one point, do I contradict myself? Do I have to be stretched in so many different directions that I feel like I'm being torn apart? And his answer is wonderfully matter of fact. Very well then, I contradict myself. Because life is contradictory. Being a smart nation is going to involve all sorts of contradictions as we try to be both technological and human, kind and firm at the same time. But that's okay. If we are large enough, we can contain those multitudes. And I think Whitman captures there the importance not just of eating lots at a buffet, right? But making sure that we contain multitudes in the metaphorical sense. And the stories we tell ourselves help us to do that containing. Because we remember through those stories that maybe it's okay that we don't solve everything. Because some problems in life are meant to be managed, not solved. So I've shared 6 stories with you, right? Stories of growth rather than fixed mindsets, of communities rather than crowds, of an internal rather than external locus of control, gifts and assets rather than weaknesses and gaps, campaigns and movements rather than disconnected events, and embracing contradictions rather than feeling that they tear us apart. And I think at this stage, it's important to ask ourselves, why do stories matter? Why is it important that what the smart nation says to itself, not to everybody else in the world, is important? And there's a very simple reason for it, which is that we grow into the stories we tell ourselves. This is a sculpture of the Greek titan Prometheus. That's as much of a myth as anyone can have, right? And we can choose to be different aspects of this story. We can choose to be the titan that stood up to the gods and stole fire and said, we are free people, we will do what we need to do, right? We will give ourselves permission to do the things that are necessary. Or we can choose to be the titan that gets caught and punished and has his liver eaten by an eagle every single day. I think we have choices, and that the aspects of the stories we tell will affect what we grow into. If the stories are small stories, then we will stay small. If the stories are large, then we will grow into those capacities. And what's really funny is that these stories are really not that new. I mentioned all the people doing research about these stories, but in a sense, Singapore's been telling these stories to ourselves for the longest time. These men are amongst the first cabinet of leaders that we had, right? The people who steered and guided the nation in the process of separation from Malaysia. One of them believed that we could become a metropolis from what we were at that point. A collection of some retail trade, but lots of mudflats and swamps as well. Another of them believed that we could take the western end of the island and turn it from swamp and marshy area into one of the most eminent industrial estates in the world. Collections of agglomerating economies that allowed for commerce to thrive. And lest anyone think that all of our stories were just about commerce and functional things, this man believed that we could take disparate communities from fundamentally different ethnicities and tribes and different backgrounds and have them become a community. A smart nation must keep believing these dreams because they were dreams of vision and audacity and the kind of gung-ho courage that I think will be necessary as we try and define the future. Because that future that we define will not be one that is easily recognizable, but it will be one that involves going back to the past as much as it involves looking into the future. In the spirit of what T.S. Eliot said in these wonderful lines, right? We're always exploring. Smart nations must explore, because that's the only kind of curiosity that will allow them to continue to define new boundaries. But the end of all that exploring will be to come back and know the place that we return to for the first time. Not in an alien way, but in a way that we unearth new familiarities, new aspects, and the things that we weren't able to see before. So what do I hope the Smart Nation manages to do? I hope it manages to create new myths and new stories for the future, but remembering that those stories will come from our history and many of the things that we already know deep down inside. Thank you.